When it comes to decks that are easy to pick up and play, have an easy win condition and take the least amount of time to understand, there are few decks simpler than Burn, in both GOAT format and the present TCG. At its core, Burn only has one goal, to deliver at least 8,000 points of effect damage to the opponent, while preventing them from attacking you and your monsters long enough to win the game. Now, one could definitely argue that Burn is by no means a complicated deck. After all, we're looking to only attack our opponent's life totals, and often really don't care about the board state as long as it doesn't threaten our stall cards. Now, while it's true you won't need to worry about what your opponent is doing as much as with other decks, I would argue this makes the deck an ideal way to learn the format, as you're able to observe your opponents playing their decks and learn how they play them without being distracted with trying to match a more experienced player's skill level. In addition to this, if you are a more advanced or competitive GOAT player, then Burn can be a good counter to the meta, as it's somewhat of a dark horse deck in terms of top tier decks, and many players will not be thinking about it at a high level event, mostly expecting Chaos and Warriors and maybe GOAT control, leaving them woefully unprepared in terms of side decking most of the time. Now, in this particular video, I will be looking at the most well-known kind of Burn deck, Lockdown or Stall Burn. I'm aware there are other versions of the deck in GOAT, from Bad Reaction Burn to Fire Princess Burn and the more recent Beast or Panda Burn. However, I will eventually cover those in a supplementary video down the line. Now, oftentimes in these videos, I'll break a deck down into its monsters, spells and traps. However, as Burn plays very differently to most standard decks, instead I'll be breaking cards down into the three main components of Burn: Lockdown cards, Burn cards and utility cards. So with all that being said, let's begin. There are three main cards often used in Burn to start the game: Messenger of Peace, Level Limit Area B and Gravity Bind. While each is slightly different, they all essentially serve the same purpose of making sure your opponent can't attack you while you're setting their life points on fire with your Burn spells, with Level Limit Area B preventing all level 4 and above monsters from changing to attack mode, and Gravity Bind simply preventing them from attacking. Messenger of Peace is slightly different in that it goes by attack points rather than level, with all monsters within drum or attack prevented from attacking. Most builds of Lockdown Burn tend to run 2 to 3 Messenger, whilst Area and Gravity Bind are both at 2, so we run the legal maximum. Finally, many builds also tend to run a couple of Walls of Revealing Light, a normal trap that for the cost of paying points in 1000 point intervals, prevents all monsters with points lower than the amount paid from attacking. It's important to run around 6 to 8 of these stall cards, due to the abundance of spell and trap removal in the format. The last thing you want as a Burn player is for your opponent to drop an MST or, God forbid, Heavy Storm on you, and you having no way of responding to the board of monsters you've not been interacting with waiting to tear you to shreds. Moving on to the Burn cards, we'll start with the monsters that can do repeated or high amounts of damage. One of the benefits of Lockdown Burn is that sometimes the deck's monsters can burn out the opponent all by themselves, without the need for the plethora of trap cards, which means that our deck does an auto-scoop to a Jinzo. In terms of monsters that deliver high amounts of damage, we have three main ones: Desk Koala, Stealth Bird and Lava Golem. Beginning with our furry friend, Desk Koala is a flip effect monster that upon being flipped deals 400 points of damage to an opponent for each card in their hand. Now obviously this is a good early game card when our opponent hasn't played many cards. However, with Chaos decks that love to recycle their draw cards with Magician of Faith, and a few cards in our deck that can fill up both players' hands, don't underestimate how much damage this guy can do mid to late game. If played correctly, Koala can often dish out between 1200 and 2400 damage in one flip, thus quickly reducing our opponent's turn clock. In stark contrast to Desk Koala, one-shot Burn, we have the slow burn, pun intended, of the flip-flopping menace that is Stealth Bird. Possessing a similar effect to the Swarm monsters, Stealth Bird can flip itself face down once a turn, and when flip summoned it deals 1000 points of damage to the opponent. By itself this card is powerful as it's an 8-turn clock for an opponent at full life points. However, when combined with a few other Burn cards, it can lead to games ending extremely fast. Finally, in terms of Burn monsters, we have a card that modern players will be familiar with in Lava Golem. A unique card for its time, Lava Golem can only be summoned to the opponent's side of the field by triggering 2 of their monsters. It will then burn our opponent for 1000 points of damage during each of their standby phases. Like Stealth Bird, this card can quickly reduce their opponent's life to 0, however the tribute effect of this card is even more useful, as it can be used to remove troublesome monsters that can get under our stall cards like Thousand Eyes Restrict. Moving on from our burn monsters to our spells, we'll start with one of the most famous burn spells in Yu-Gi-Oh!, Wave Motion Cannon. A continuous spell, the cannon works similar to Stealth Bird in that it deals damage in increments of 1000. However, unlike Stealth Bird or Lava Golem, the cannon doesn't do damage each turn. Instead, the cannon gains a counter each turn, which can be cashed in along with the cannon to do damage equal to 1000 times the number of counters. This card is basically a ticking time bomb on the field that our opponent has to get rid of very quickly or lose in one big explosive shot. In terms of other burn spells, many burn players don't run much more than the cannon, and some even forgo spells entirely. However, there are some more aggressive versions of burn that run cards like Meteor of Destruction, Tremendous Fire, Poisons of the Old Man, and Darkroom of Nightmare. Now the first two are simple 1000 point burn damage cards, and Poison does another 800. However, Darkroom burns in a slightly different way. Each time an effect burns their opponent, the Darkroom will add an additional 300 points to that damage. You may remember this card from the early builds of Trickstars. Now while this isn't too much damage at first, trust me, it will build up very quickly. Finally, let's talk about the main part of any burn deck, the traps. Traps are the lifeblood of most burn decks and consist of most of the strongest burn effects in the game. Let's begin with arguably the strongest burn card in GOAT, Ceasefire. Limited to 1 with good reason at the time, Ceasefire is not only a powerful damage dealer, but an excellent all-round anti-meta card. When activated, Ceasefire will flip all monsters face up without triggering flip effects, and deal our opponent 500 points of damage per monster. Now the damage is pretty nice, in most cases doing at least 1000 points per activation, but what really makes this card great is the anti-flip effect. GOAT is filled with powerful flip monsters like Magician of Faith, Mask of Darkness, the Jars, and Magical Merchant. And a card like Ceasefire can sort of neuter some of the top tier strategies that run these cards, like GOAT Control and Chaos. Also, as it does damage for every monster on the opponent's board, it combines well with the next trap in this list, Ojama Trio. A card that saw play in burn decks right up to the Link era, Ojama Trio is a normal trap that summons 3 Ojama tokens with the same stats as the original Ojama to the opponent's side of the field. These tokens can be tributed for a tribute summon, and when destroyed they do 300 points of damage to the opponent. Now this card has 3 main purposes in this deck. Number 1 is to come up with the opponent's board so they can't summon many monsters. Number 2 is to do a bit of burn themselves, but most importantly, they build up our opponent's field to combine with a bunch of traps that burn them for each card on their field, like the aforementioned Ceasefire and a couple of cards we'll see later. Like I said, this card is a really powerful card in burn decks, seeing play right up until Links made it somewhat redundant. Up next we have the 2 burn spells that work the best with Ojama Trio, in Just Desserts and Secret Barrel. Both of these cards have similar effects, and they do a certain amount of damage to the opponent for each card on their field. Just Desserts is the simpler of the two, being one of the first burn cards ever printed, as it does 500 points damage to the opponent for each monster on their side of the field. Mainly with Ojama Trio and opponent having one of their own monsters, this card can do 2000 points of damage. Secret Barrel, on the other hand, has the ability to do 200 points damage to the opponent for every card in their field and in their hand, meaning that while each individual card does less damage to the opponent, overall this card will often do even more damage than Just Desserts. Both of these cards are key players in burn, both in GOAT and to this day, with them both seen play in chain burn still. Up next we have my favourite trap in the deck, Nightmare Wheel. Because what's better than a burn card? A burn card that doubles as a spellbinding circle. When activated, this trap will mobilize a monster, leaving it unable to attack or change its battle position, and will burn your opponent for 500 every single turn. In addition to the burn damage, this card serves 2 major purposes. Firstly, it serves as a last line of defense in the event we lose our floodgates to a heavy storm or MST, by at least preventing the biggest monster our opponent controls from doing damage to us, hopefully keeping them at bay long enough to re-establish a lock on the board. Secondly, if we're able to keep our floodgates online, this card can be helpful with dealing with cards that can slip under cards like Gravity Bind and Limit Area B, most notably Thousand Eyes Restrict. Up next in our burn lineup we have our battle traps, or traps used to interact with attacking monsters. Being a deck with as many stall options as we have, we don't require as many of these as your average GOAT deck, but there are a couple that either work towards our deck's win con or are too good to pass up. While technically not a battle trap, Ring of Destruction can be used like one, and is often used during the battle phase, so I'm going to count it here. When triggered, this card will destroy any monster before inflicting damage to both players equal to the monster's attack points. For this on a big monster like BLS or Chaos Sorcerer or even Berserk Gorilla, and late game you could be looking at lethal damage with other burn cards. Also, keep in mind this card is pre-errated in this format, so yes, you can ring a destruction for game when you're on lower life than your opponent. Our other main burn battle trap in this deck is Magic Cylinder. One of the most iconic battle traps in Yu-Gi-Oh!, even appearing in the anime, Cylinder can negate one attack and then deal damage to the opponent equal to the attack of the negated monster. Again, like Ring, using this on a big monster like BLS can dramatically reduce the amount of damage needed to win the game with our other burn spells, and like Nightmare Wheel, this card can be an excellent lifeline if we lose our floodgates. The only real downside to this card is it's the only one in our burn lineup that can only be activated in the battle phase, meaning it's not chainable to removal spells and is thus vulnerable to MST and Dust Tornado. So this is a very powerful burn card, but it's the one we must play very cautiously in order to work optimally. The final aspect of burn are the utility cards, or cards we have that are not a direct part of our strategy, but do insist in completing it. First up in this category is Sangan, which allows us to search any monster with 1500 or less attack from the deck to hand upon being sent to the graveyard. This is already a powerful effect, but in this deck, Sangan allows us to access to every monster we play, as none of our burn cards or any of our utility creatures have much attack points, making Sangan a Swiss army knife of sorts, able to search us any answer we need at any time, be it burn, high defense, or utility. Our other main utility monsters are the Jars in Morphing and Cyber Jar, both of which when flipped allow us to draw a new hand of 5 cards. Morphing Jar is the more simple of the two, just allowing us to draw a whole new hand of 5 when flipped, whereas Cyber Jar lets both players draw 5 and put any monsters they draw with 4 stars or less onto the field, either attack or face down defense. Now Morphing Jar is very simple, again just refills our hand, but with Cyber Jar, not only do we get a refill, but if we hit our Stealth Birds or Death Koalas, this card also furthers our burn strategy by speeding up the amount of burn we have on the board. Now these cards can be dangerous as they fill our opponent's hand as well. However, because of our floodgates, it's not as bad as it would be in other decks, seeing as it's not as likely our opponent's going to find a way to beat us down. The only thing we have to be careful of is that our opponent may draw a Heavy Storm or a Mystical Space Typhoon off of these, so that's just something to keep in mind before using these cards. In terms of utility spells, this deck is characteristically light on them. Obviously we run Pot of Greed and Graceful Charity for the card draw, and some builds will also run Duo as a way to try to snipe back row hit from the opponent's hand. In addition to this, some burn decks do run the Scapegoat Metamorphosis package, which makes sense as these cards do have some synergy with the rest of the deck, seeing as Goat tokens can help prevent attacks, and Thousand Eyes can both remove troublesome monsters, in particular Death Wombat, which otherwise shuts down burn hard games 2 and 3, and it can also attack under our floodgates like Gravity Bind and Level Limit Area B. In terms of the first utility traps for burn decks, we have staples of Mirror Force and Torrential Tribute, because while we'd rather not wipe the board for cards like Battle and Just Desserts, sometimes it is necessary to survive. Both of these cards are lifesavers when your store cards eat a Heavy Storm or MST, and can often give us time to rebuild in the worst case scenario. For our final utility trap, we run Solemn Judgment. Now, unlike in decks like Gravekeepers, it's not guaranteed that we'll win the game fast enough. The Storm's negative effect won't be a problem. However, with our floodgates up, it's unlikely our opponent can make us pay too much for losing half our life points, and stopping a blowout from cards like Heavy Storm, Royal Decree and Jinzo is worth it most of the time. In terms of the deck's side deck, our most pressing concern is protecting our back row. As such, the first card we run is 7 Tools of the Bandit, in order to out Royal Decree, because even though we can win with our monsters in cannon, burn becomes a lot worse when we lose access to our trap cards. For similar reasons, we want to run an out to problematic monsters, most notably Jinzo for shutting down our back row, and Thousand Eyes Restrict for being able to get under our floodgates. The best options for this include Tribute to the Doomed, Lightning Vortex, and possibly Swarm of Scarabs, since its flip ability synergizes very well with the deck's playstyle of floodgates and stalling. Speaking of flip monsters, No Man of Crossout is another good consideration, as it can be a good way of taking out ways our opponents have of accessing back row, such as Magician of Faith and Magical Merchant. In particular, this card can be helpful against Pac-Man as well, a deck that really doesn't care about our floodgates, and this can be a bit of a problem for us. Another interesting side deck option can be Legendary Jujutsu Master, which when attacked will bounce a monster to the top of the opponent's deck. This card's high defense and effect combine to make a very powerful war monster, and the bounce effect is especially powerful against monsters that aren't normal summonable, like Chaos monsters or any tribute summon like Monarchs. Finally, we can include some of the utility cards I mentioned earlier if we don't main deck them, and we can also possibly play more one-off stall cards like Threatening Rumble Boku as more backup in case we're facing a deck with heavy back row removal. Overall, Burn may not be the most fun deck to play against, and it is very simplistic, but it can be both a great starting point for new players or a surprise powerhouse in the hands of a more experienced one. It's a strategy that will likely always be a thing in Yu-Gi-Oh!, and in GOAT it's one of its strongest points. Also keep in mind that Burn is one of the more versatile strategies in Yu-Gi-Oh!, with being like 4 other options outside of the one I showed today in GOAT alone. But that's for another video. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next video.